The name near the bottom of the stack stopped her cold. Dana Whitfield had spent the morning moving through a pile of maintenance applications without looking up once. The candidates, all competent enough, all forgettable. But that name she read twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change what was printed on the page. Marcus Bell. She lifted her eyes. The man standing across the reception area wore a jacket that had seen too many winters. His face had aged quietly and without mercy. But the name, that name, she had never forgotten. Dana didn't send for him through the front desk. She walked out herself, folder in hand, and found him in one of the plastic chairs along the far wall. Not checking his phone, not fidgeting, just sitting with his hands on his knees, looking at the floor with the calm of someone long past expecting much from waiting rooms. She said his name. He looked up. There was no flash of recognition on his face at first. Only a man trying to play someone who clearly already knew him. Then something shifted behind his eyes, slow and careful, like a door opening just enough to let in a single line of light. "Dana," he said. Not a question, not surprise, just the words spoken the way you say the name of something you thought you'd lost. She brought him into her office rather than the standard interview room. It was a decision she made without fully thinking it through, and she didn't examine it too closely. She set the folder on the desk between them and looked at him the way you look at a photograph that doesn't quite match the memory you've been carrying. Marcus Bell had been the kind of student professors mentioned years after he graduated. Not because he was loud or competitive, but because his mind made difficult things look almost gentle, like he was simply reading something the rest of the room hadn't learned to see yet. Dana had sat 2 rows behind him in signals and systems during their senior year, scraping by while everyone else kept pace. Marcus had never made her feel embarrassed about it. He explained things the way a good electrician explains a circuit, not to impress you, but to make sure the current has somewhere to go. After graduation, he vanished. No forwarding address, no updates through mutual friends. He was simply gone, the way people are gone when life takes a turn that doesn't leave room for staying in touch. And now here he was 44, applying to fix vending machines and change air filters. Dana opened the folder. His application was filled out cleanly, even handwriting. Under previous employment, freight dispatch, a stint installing home security systems, 2 years of overnight stocking at a hardware distributor. Under education, simply BS electrical engineering. No class rank listed, though she remembered it being the kind of number that made department chairs take notice. "HR flag your file," she said. She kept her voice even, professional, because the alternative was to sound like what she actually was, a person struggling to reconcile 2 completely different images of the same man. They felt your background was, in their words, excessive for the position. It almost didn't make it past the first screening. Marcus nodded as though this wasn't news. "I figured it might." She closed the folder. "Why this position? Facilities, I mean." He didn't answer right away. He looked at her with the same steadiness he'd always had, the kind that used to make her feel like he was actually listening and not just waiting for his turn to speak. When he did answer, his voice carried no performance in it. "I need something predictable," he said. "No deadlines that move on me. Something where I show up, do the work, and know exactly what I'm going home to at the end of the day." He said it without bitterness, which somehow made it land harder than resentment would have. "I've had enough of the other kind." Dana studied him. She wanted to ask what had happened in the 22 years since she'd last seen him. Why a man who could have designed control systems for half the companies on this floor was asking to replace fluorescent bulbs. But she'd known Marcus long enough to understand he'd answer only what he was ready to answer, and pushing early would close a door that might otherwise stay open. "There's a position on the network operations team," she said. "Junior, technically, but the work is closer to what you actually know. It pays nearly triple what facilities pays. I can move your file over, and no one needs to know it was ever anywhere else." Something moved across his face, not quite gratitude, not quite refusal. He leaned forward slightly, hands folded on his knees, exactly as he'd been sitting in the waiting area. "I appreciate that," he said. "I mean it, but I'd like the facilities job, if it's still open. No apology, no defensive edge. I'm not ready for the other thing. Not yet." Dana sat without a moment. She had run Meridian Signal for 8 years. She had made decisions that cost tens of millions and decisions that saved the same. She was not easily surprised. But the quiet certainty in Marcus Bell's voice reached past her professional instincts and landed somewhere more human. She told him the position was still available. She told HR to process the paperwork that afternoon. Marcus started the following Monday. He came in before the building opened. Dana didn't learn this from him. She learned it from a night security guard, who mentioned it the way you mentioned something unremarkable, that the new maintenance hire was already there when the guard clocked out, moving through the lobby with a cart like he had nowhere else to be and was perfectly content with that. The guard said Marcus didn't talk much, but always nodded when you passed him. The kind of nod that meant something without requiring a response. By the end of the first week, Marcus had reorganized the electrical closet on the 6th floor in a way that cut breaker panel troubleshooting time nearly in half. No one had asked him to. The building manager noticed and mentioned it to facilities, who mentioned it to no one in particular. It was the kind of improvement that made things run better without drawing attention to the person who'd made it happen. But not everyone was indifferent to Marcus. The operations floor was managed by a man named Roy Halstead, who'd been with the company long enough to believe seniority was the same thing as authority, and that anyone below his pay grade existed primarily for his convenience. He was the kind of manager who spoke loudly in open spaces and kept a running account of who owed him what. Within Marcus's first 2 weeks, Halstead had called him back 3 times to redo work that didn't need redoing, interrupted him in front of junior staff over a panel cover that hadn't actually been left loose, and once stopped him in the hallway to complain, loudly, about the smell of contact cleaner, while 2 employees looked on and said nothing. Marcus took all of it without visible reaction, listened, nodded, went back to work. He didn't complain to HR. He simply absorbed it and moved past it the way water moves around a stone, because moving around is more efficient than stopping to argue. Dana witnessed one exchange from across the floor, Halstead explaining, with exaggerated patience, that a professional would have caught a labeling error before being told. Marcus nodded, said he'd take care of it, and turned back to his cart. No slump in his shoulders. Halstead caught Dana's eye, the brief, uncertain look of a man realizing he had an audience he hadn't accounted for, then straightened and walked back to his office. Dana said nothing that day, but she filed it away. The weeks settled into a routine. Marcus moved through the building like a fixed point, always present, always working, always exactly where he was supposed to be. Employees who'd initially ignored him began to nod when he passed. Yolanda, the ground floor receptionist, started leaving a thermos of coffee on his cart every morning without explanation. He'd find it, drink it, leave the empty thermos where she could find it. Nothing was ever said about it. It was simply a thing that happened. Dana found herself watching him sometimes, not as a CEO monitoring performance, but with the attention you give something you're trying to understand. He was not performing contentment, and that struck her most. She'd seen people perform contentment, had done it herself in board meetings, projecting a steadiness she didn't always feel. Marcus's calm wasn't a performance. It was just what he was. She hadn't asked him again about the years between. She decided to let him bring it to her, if he ever chose to. But the question hadn't left her. It lived in the back of her, thinking the way a piece of music you half remember lives in the back of your hearing, present, unresolved, waiting. One evening she was leaving late and found him in the lobby, coiling a cord near the entrance. The building was mostly empty. Marcus worked without music, without anything to suggest the silence bothered him. "You're still here," she said. He looked up. Couple more panels to check. She stood a moment longer than necessary. "Are you all right?" She wasn't sure what she meant, tonight, or in general, or across the whole span of years between them. Marcus looked at her steadily. "Yeah, I'm all right." He said it without qualification, which was either the most honest answer she'd heard in months or the most careful one. She couldn't tell which. She said goodnight and walked to her car. Behind her, through the glass doors, his reflection kept moving, unhurried, like a man tending to something private she hadn't yet been asked to understand. She sat in the car a moment before starting the engine. The last time she'd seen Marcus Bell, they were 22, standing outside the engineering building on the last day of finals. He talked her through a problem set she'd been failing since October, then shrugged off her thanks, said the solution was already in her notes, he'd just pointed at it. Then he'd walked off across the quad, and she had assumed, the way you assume things at 22, that she'd see him again. She'd been wrong about that. Now, she started the engine and pulled out of the lot, and the question she'd been carrying settled more firmly into something she could no longer set aside. Something had happened to Marcus Bell. Something had been a trajectory that should have led to a research fellowship, a career built around the thing he was best at, all the way down to a cart and a supply closet on the 6th floor. She didn't know what it was yet, but she was going to find out. The crisis came on a Thursday. It started the way most crises in technology companies start, quietly, then all at once. A flag in the routing monitor at 5:40 in the morning, dismissed by the overnight team as a routine anomaly. By 9, the anomaly had spread into the core allocation layer of the company's flagship signal routing platform. By 11, the engineering leads were in the main conference room on the 8th floor with their laptops open and their faces arranged in the specific expression that meant things were worse than they were saying out loud. Dana came in at 11:10. She listened to the technical director, a sharp and generally unflappable woman named Priya Kapoor, explain that the load balancing model governing bandwidth allocation for 3 of their largest carrier clients had developed a cascading error in its weighting function. Not catastrophic yet, but progressing. Left uncorrected for a few more hours, the system would begin misrouting live traffic, penalties in the tens of millions, and client trust that would take years to rebuild. Priya's team had been on it since 7. They'd found where the error was expressing itself, but not where it originated. The specific point in the weighting logic buried somewhere in a sequence of matrix operations no one had managed to isolate. The whiteboard at the far end of the room was covered in notation. Formulas branching into subformulas, arrows connecting variables to outcomes, 3 different colored markers tracing 3 different failed approaches. The engineers moved between their screens and the board with the restlessness of people who understood the problem well enough to know that understanding it wasn't the same as solving it. Marcus came in at 11:35. He wasn't supposed to be in the conference room. He was supposed to be servicing the HVAC intake outside it, part of his Thursday rotation. The door had been propped with a chair, and Marcus had worked his way down the hall until he stood in the doorway, reaching to pull the chair back so he could shut the door and get to the vent. He didn't move the chair. He stood in the door frame and looked at the whiteboard. No one noticed him at first. The room, too, absorbed in its own pressure, engineers typing, Priya on the phone. Marcus stood still and looked at the board for close to a minute, long enough for Dana, near the back wall, to register him and look up. He wasn't reading the board the way a passerby reads something unfamiliar. He was reading it the way you read something you recognize, focused, checking whether the text in front of you matches what you already know to be true. Dana watched him. She didn't call across the room. She waited. Marcus turned his head and found her eyes without searching. There was a question in his expression, not a spoken one, just the particular look of a man who has seen something and is trying to decide whether saying so is his place. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage without anyone else at the table noticing. He crossed to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, found a clear section, and wrote. Not slowly, not performing intelligence, but the way you write when the answer is already formed and the hand is just catching up to the mind. 6 lines of matrix notation, ending in a single bracketed term that isolated the fault in the weighting sequence. Then he set the marker down and stepped back. Priya was still on the phone. One of the junior engineers, Dev Aluwalia, who hadn't yet learned to disguise his reactions, looked at the board and said, out loud, "Who wrote that?" The room turned. Priya ended her call. Someone laughed, short, uncomfortable, because the man by the whiteboard wore a gray uniform shirt with the company logo on the chest and had a service cart parked in the hall behind him. "I could be wrong," Marcus said. He said it simply, without deflection, the same tone he might use to note that a filter needed changing. "But if the fault's in the waiting term, that's where I'd start." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has happened that no one has a script for. Priya walked to the board, stood in front of Marcus's 6 lines, ran something through a laptop. Her expression moved through skepticism attention, recognition, and then the specific look of someone who's just watched a locked door open without a key. "Run it," she said, still looking at the board. 14 minutes later, the fault flag cleared. The cascading error stopped where it was. No one said anything to Marcus directly. He retrieved the chair, finished the intake vent, and moved on to the next stop on his rotation. By the time the room reorganized around its relief, he was already 2 floors down. Dana found him that afternoon near the service elevator on the 4th floor. She didn't lead with what had happened in the conference room. She let it sit between them a moment before she said anything, because some things need a beat of silence before they can be spoken about without sounding like a transaction. "Where did that come from?" she asked. Marcus set his card against the wall. He looked at her with the same steadiness he always had, though something in his eyes was slightly more open than usual, like a window cracked just enough to change the air in a room. "I've had a lot of time to think," he said. "When the work in front of you doesn't take everything you have, your mind goes somewhere. Mine usually goes back to systems." He said this without any attempt to make it sound significant. Just a fact delivered plainly. Dana looked at him. "What happened, Marcus?" "After graduation. I need to understand." He was quiet a few seconds, not evasive, just organizing. When he spoke, his voice was level, without the performance of someone rehearsing their own hardship for an audience. His younger sister had been in a car accident this spring after he finished his degree, not fatal, but permanently disabling, the kind of injury that required round-the-clock care. Their mother couldn't manage alone. While working, he'd been 6 weeks from starting a research fellowship at a lab that designed adaptive control systems. He deferred once, then again, and by the time his sister had stabilized enough for the family to manage. Without him, full-time, the fellowship had gone to someone else, and the funding cycle had closed. He'd taken what work he could find, freight, warehouse shifts, anything steady that let him be home in the evenings. Each time he tried to move back toward his training, the resume gap came up, or his age, or the market had shifted. After enough years of that, a person stops spending energy on doors that don't open. Later, in his late 30s, he'd become a single father when his daughter's mother left. She was 12 now. And the predictability he'd been chasing wasn't really for him. It was for her. "I don't tell people this because I want sympathy," he said. He was looking for a reaction, just explaining the facts. "So she'd have them. I made the choices I made because they were the right ones at the time. I'd make them again." Dana held his gaze. "You could have called someone. You could have called me. You had your own life to build," he said. "I wasn't going to show up at someone else's door with my problems." She wanted to argue with that. She didn't because she recognized the argument would be about making herself feel better rather than anything useful to him. Instead, she said, "That wasn't your decision to make for me." Marcus looked at her a moment. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "Maybe not," he said. She left it there, but she was thinking as she walked back to the elevator about the fellowship he'd deferred and the research career that had never happened and the mind that had been quietly, steadily running calculations in whatever quiet hours a warehouse shift or a night stocking route allowed, because some things don't switch off no matter what the rest of a life looks like around them. She was also thinking about what she was going to do with that. The answer came sooner than she expected, and in a form she hadn't anticipated. Word of what had happened in the conference room traveled the way things travel in office buildings, not through official channels, but through the informal network of people who'd been in the room and people who'd heard about it from people who'd been in the room, and people who simply noticed that the alert quietly escalating through the morning had just as quietly stopped by the end of the day. Enough of the right people knew that a maintenance worker had walked into a room full of engineers and written the fix to a problem they'd been failing to solve for 6 hours. Roy Halstead heard about it before 5. He came to Dana's office at 5:20. Didn't sit and explained in the measured tone of someone who decided what he was going to say before he walked in, that what happened was a serious breach of protocol. A contractor-tier employee had entered a restricted meeting and engaged directly with proprietary infrastructure without authorization. He used the word liability twice, precedent once, and made clear he thought the matter required a formal response directed at the employee who caused it. Dana listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question: whether the routing fault had been fixed. Halstead said that was beside the point. Dana said it was in fact exactly the point, and that she'd look into it. She said it in the tone that meant the conversation was over. Halstead left. Dana sat at her desk a long time after she knew what he was doing. She'd seen it before, the particular institutional defensiveness that activates when someone outside the hierarchy does something the hierarchy couldn't. It was about protocol. It was about the fact that a man who cleaned filters had solved what a room full of credentialed engineers hadn't, and that was a kind of disruption certain people found more threatening than any routing fault. She was gonna let it go quietly, but she also understood she wasn't the only voice in the room when it came to decisions that touched the board. 2 days later, 2 board members contacted her directly, brief she suspected by someone who framed it as a security issue rather than what it actually was. Careful language, the kind that keeps its distance from what it means, but the message underneath was clear. The situation needed resolving in a way that protected the company's formal structures. Dana drafted a response, deleted it, started over. The first version said too much of what she felt and not enough of what she needed to say strategically. The second was measured, focused on outcome rather than process, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The board had a position. Halstead had given them a frame, and Marcus, who'd done nothing except see something clearly and offer. It was now the center of a problem he hadn't created. She was still at her desk at 8 that evening when her assistant forwarded a message from HR. Marcus Bell had submitted his resignation effective immediately. No grievance cited, no complaint, no explanation beyond a single line that said he appreciated the opportunity and wished the company well. Dana read it twice, then she walked down to the 6th floor to the supply closet near the service hallway, where Marcus' cart was parked. His personal items, a thermos, a pair of work gloves, a small spiral notebook neatly set in a bag beside it. He was gone. He and told her he was going. He simply decided in the quiet and deliberate way he decided most things that leaving was the cleanest solution available, that his presence had become a problem for her, and that removing himself was the most direct way to solve it. She stood in the hallway. A long time. The building was nearly empty. The fluorescent light above the door hummed. She had lost him once 22 years ago, without understanding how. Now she knew the answer, and he was gone again. And this time she watched it happen. She picked up his thermos, his gloves, his notebook, and held them the way you hold something belonging to a person you're not ready to let become a memory again. The notebook was small, dark green, the kind sold in bulk at office supply stores. Dana didn't open it that night. She brought it home, set everything on the kitchen counter, made coffee, didn't drink it, and sat at the table doing nothing in particular. She opened it the next morning before work. The first several pages were what she might have expected, equations, the kind that fill margins when a mind has nowhere else to put itself. Some were clearly work-related allocation models, weighting functions, probability chains, resembling the company's own architecture. He hadn't been working from any proprietary documents. He arrived at similar places by his own road the way to. People can walk toward the same city from opposite directions and meet in the middle without planning it. But the later pages stopped her toward the back. The equations gave way to shorter entries not addressed to anyone. He wrote about the year after his sister's accident, about the exhaustion of being the only person available and knowing that exhaustion wasn't an excuse to stop. He wrote about a warehouse job he lost at 39 when the site automated. He wrote about his daughter, about wanting to give her a stability he had, and about the fellowship he deferred, not with regret, but with the clear-eyed accounting of someone trying to understand their own life rather than mourn it. Near the last written page, he copied a single line, the same line he said to her in the hallway outside the supply closet weeks earlier. Not everyone who takes the long way around is lost. Dana closed the notebook. She sat with her hands flat on the cover a moment, looking at nothing. Then she got up, got her coat, and went to find him. She didn't have his address through the company. He delisted a post office box, which she hadn't thought anything of at the time. She went through the HR system herself, overriding 2 layers of access. There was an emergency contact form with a handwritten address on the north side of the city, a neighborhood that had been declining for years. She drove there herself, no call. First, a 3-story building, a buzzer panel with several names in faded marker. Marcus's name was their 2nd floor, written in the same clean hand as the notebook. He answered after a few seconds, a long beat, then said her name, nothing attached to it. And buzzer in his apartment was small, an orderly 1 main room, a narrow window, a kid's backpack hung on a hook by the door, books stacked in even columns against the wall. A card table near the window held a legal pad covered in the same notation she'd seen in the notebook he'd been working when she arrived, or thinking, which for Marcus was often the same thing. He offered her the chair at the table and sat on the arm of the couch across from her, and they looked at each other the way two people look at each other when a great deal needs to be said and neither one is entirely sure where the beginning of it is. Dana set the notebook on the table. Between them, she didn't explain how she'd come to read it. He already understood, and didn't seem to mind. He looked at it a moment, then back at her. The project stalled. She said, Priya's team hit another wall yesterday. What you gave them was right. It was just one layer of the problem. There are two more underneath it. She said this plainly. I need you to come back. He was quiet a moment outside. A bus moved slowly down the street below the window. Dana, I know how it ended. I know what happened with the board and with Halstead. She said, I know you left to make it easier for me, which I didn't ask you to do, and which I'm telling you now wasn't necessary. She kept her voice level. This wasn't a speech, and she didn't want it to sound like one. I'm not asking you to come back to facilities. I'm asking you to come back as a systems consultant. You'd work with the engineering teams directly on problem-solving methodology. No large title, no corner office. You'd be treated the same as everyone else, which is something I should have enforced better. The first time Marcus turned the legal pad face down, a small automatic gesture, as though he didn't want the work in progress part of the conversation. What about the board? I handle the board. She said, what does that mean? It means I explained in terms they couldn't reasonably object to, that a maintenance worker had written to fix to a failure, a room full of engineers with advanced degrees spent 6 hours failing to find, and that any company that responds to that by removing him ISN team managing its assets intelligently. She let that sit. Two of them pushed back. I told them I'd schedule a follow-up once they found someone else who could do what you did. That ended the conversation. Something moved in Marcus's expression, not quite amusement, not quite disbelief. He looked at her the way you look at someone who has just done something you wouldn't have predicted, even from a person you knew well. And Halstead, he asked. Roy Halstead is no longer with the company. She said that decision was mine, and I'd have made it regardless of the conference room. What I watched him do to you over 6 weeks was enough on its own. She said it without heat would have made it sound like vindication. I'm sorry. I didn't move sooner. Marcus was quiet for a long time. He looked at the window. The light coming through it was flat and gray, the kind of late morning light that carries no particular warmth but illuminates everything evenly. I'm not looking for a redemption arc, he said finally, a genuine statement, not a rejection. I'm not interested in being someone's story about how talent always finds a way. I know, she said, that's not what I'm asking you to be. Then what are you asking? To come into a building full of people who are very good at certain things and completely unable to think outside them, and spend time with them, not to fix them, to show them a different way. And she kept it simple, because the simple version was the true version. You've been doing that your whole life. You did it for me in a classroom 22 years ago. Now I can just compensate you for it. Marcus looked at the notebook on the table. He reached out and turned it right side up again, looked at the cover the way you look at something you've carried so long you've stopped seeing it clearly. No title, he said, consultant internal, whatever the badge says. The actual function is what I described. No separate office, but there's a room on the 3rd floor that's been used for storage for 2 years. We'll clear it out. He was quiet again. She let him be quiet, because Marcus had always needed the room to think that most people try to fill with more talking. All right, he said, it wasn't a dramatic concession, just a decision made the same deliberate way he made most decisions, with the minimum necessary words and without performing the weight of it. Dana nodded. She picked up the notebook and held it out to him. He took it. She told him she'd have the paperwork ready by the end of the week, and that she'd address the full staff before he started, because she wasn't going to let him walk back into that building without the people in it understanding what had happened and why he said that wasn't necessary. She said it was, and that it wasn't up for negotiation, which made the corner of his mouth move, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. She stood to leave at the door. She stopped Marcus. She said. He looked at her from across the small room. You said something to me once in the hallway outside the supply closet about not everyone who takes the long way around being lost. She held his gaze. I read it in the notebook too. I want you to know I think about it. It's one of the truest things I've heard in a long time. Marcus looked at her steadily. Took me a while to believe it myself, he said. She left him there with the legal pad and the flat gray light through the window, and drove back with the particular clarity that comes after a decision has been made, and the only thing left is to follow through. She called a full staff meeting Monday morning, 300 people, some in chairs, some along the walls. She told them what had happened with the routing failure in plain language without softening. The part where her own engineering team hadn't found the answer, she told them a man in facilities had walked past an open door and written the fix that stopped the cascading failure before the point of no return. She told them the company's response, treating it as a liability instead of a gift, had been wrong, and that she intended to correct it, starting with the fact that the person most responsible for turning it into a disciplinary matter no longer worked there. She didn't name Halstead. She didn't Neither. She told them Marcus Bell would return not to facilities, but as a consultant on systems and problem solving, and that she expected him treated with the same respect as anyone else. She said it clearly without making a lecture, because she wanted the message to be about correction, not shame. When she finished, the room was quiet a moment. Then someone began to clap, and the sound moved through the space the way sound moves when it means something. Marcus started on a Wednesday. He came in through the front entrance, and Yolanda handed him a visitor badge and told him his room was ready on the 3rd floor. He thanked her by name and took the elevator up. The room had been cleared over the weekend, a whiteboard on the far wall, a table, 4 chairs, a window over the street below. Marcus set his notebook down and stood at the whiteboard a moment, looking at it blank the way you look at something waiting to become useful. He uncapped a marker, wrote nothing for a moment, then put a single equation at the top of the board, not a solution, just a starting point, and stepped back. Something in his face has settled into the quiet of a person exactly where they're supposed to be, even if the road that led them there made no sense to anyone who only saw the destination in a room that had spent 2 years holding surplus chairs and outdated monitors. Marcus Bell picked up a marker and began to carve. It was gone, but he kept one thing from his small utility flashlight he carried in his pocket every day for 6 weeks. It sat now in the top drawer of his new desk, the kind of place you put something you're not done with yet, not a reminder of what he lost, but of the distance he crossed to get from there to here.